the fact that Trump is taking the mask off of US imperialism to the extent that he is, and actually saying outright, we can take this and take that and grab it, right, indicates that it might not be true anymore. What is Trump doing? Right? How should we understand the moves that Donald Trump has been making since coming into office, starting his second term, especially in regards to his statements about Gaza, Hamas, Israel? But some of them I don't think we can take in a vacuum. Like I think some of the statements he's been making, especially in regards to Gaza, need to be understood in the same context as his statements about Greenland and the Panama Canal and Canada. And that actually I think is very interesting because what I think is going on, I could be wrong, is that Trump has moved past the denial stage of the US empire's waning power on the global stage. Meaning, in the presidential election, neither Harris nor Trump spoke about the fact that the US is an empire in decline, that the US is increasingly weaker diplomatically, economically, in relation to its potential rivals, right? China, the BRICS nations already seem to be catching up, outperforming the US and its allies. So I think part of what Trump is doing is trying to project power that no longer exists. Meaning, for a long time, the United States had soft power, right? Everybody knew they were the global hegemon, and they could, if they wanted, do whatever they want, right? They can invade your country, they can steal your oil, right? They could assassinate your leader, right? They could do whatever they wanted. And the fact that Trump is taking the mask off of US imperialism to the extent that he is, and actually saying outright, we can take this and take that and grab it, right, indicates that it might not be true anymore. That he might be trying to compensate for the fact that the US is no longer in a position to be able to do those things that it really wants to. Maybe one of those things, but it certainly can't do all of those things. And even doing one of those things might be very costly and accelerate the empire's collapse. So I think part of it is posturing and just trying to create the impression in people's minds, which is strategically maybe the best move we can make. But to create, and this is part of making America great again, right? Trying to regain a lot of Uncle Sam's lost prestige, right? Trying to create the perception of real power and to create the impression in people's minds that the US is still an empire that has the ability to take what it wants and do what it wants, and there's nothing you can do about it, except do what you've been doing until now, which is play along, right? They basically find a way to align your interests with those of Washington, right? If Washington wants X, you got to figure out a way to make X work for you. That's basically the way the rest of the world has been dealing with the United States as a global hegemon, right? So I think that's part of this, or this is part of that, meaning I think that Trump's statements regarding Gaza can't be separated from that. Just a pattern in terms of Trump's behavior and Trump's rhetoric since coming into office, okay? The second thing I think might be behind his Gaza plan, when he talks about the United States taking over, transferring the Palestinian population, forcing other Arab states to take them in. I think this is a way for him to put a stick on the table, right? Basically, a stick for dealing with certain Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, right? For him to be able to remove in order for them to do what he wants. Similar to the way we can talk about the conversation surrounding Israeli annexation of Judea and Samaria prior to the Abraham Accords as being something that the UAE was able to claim credit for, right? When they justified their willingness to enter into normalization peace agreement with Israel, they claimed to their critics, we stopped the Israeli annexation. So it could be that this Trump plan is something for the Saudis to be able to say, we stopped, right? We entered into a normalization deal with Israel, and as a result of that, we saved the Gazan Palestinians. We saved, the population from being transferred out. And we stopped the US from taking over Gaza, or we stopped whatever, right? That could be part of it. But I think even in regards to those states, a larger part of it might be forcing them to take responsibility for Gaza. I think what the US wanted, even under Biden, was for the Palestinian Authority to rule in Gaza with help, economic help, and maybe even help in terms of, boots on the ground from the Saudis, maybe Qatar, maybe Egypt, right? And by there being no day after plan, right? For a long time, Biden wanted a day after plan. Netanyahu resisted the day after plan. It just, the Saudis had no incentive to come up with their own plan, step up, invest, take responsibility. But what Trump might have done is he might have put a plan on the table that is so abhorrent to the Arab states that they're going to have to step up and take responsibility for Gaza, and in order to avoid this plan, right? Now there's a different status quo on the table, right? Meaning if we don't come to an agreement, this is the default. And by doing that, it forces the Saudis, the Qataris, the Egyptians to come and say, hey, wait a minute, no, we're going to invest, billions of dollars, and we're going to send troops, and we're going to make sure that the Palestinian Authority is safe and able to govern, and we'll do all that, right? Because the alternative for them is worse. Or even if they don't care, if the leaders of these nations don't care, the alternative is unpopular, in their countries. So that could be what Trump is doing. Another possibility is that he's trying to neutralize Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir in terms of them seeking to torpedo the ceasefire hostage deal. And, Ben-Gvir left the government over this deal. Smotrich is still in the process of deciding whether or not to leave the government. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But in the meantime, if they really believe, like if Itamar Ben-Gvir really believes that transfer is on the table, then the ceasefire hostage deal isn't such a big deal to him anymore. Like he's willing to hold his nose and support this deal if he gets transfer, right? That's a possibility here, that he feels Prime Minister Netanyahu needs his government to remain intact in order for the ceasefire hostage deal to go through phase 2 and reach phase 3. And what happens then? Maybe Donald Trump gets a Nobel Prize, right? That he's shown that he could do what his predecessor couldn't do, right? He shows that he can stop this conflict. Get a ceasefire, get the hostages back, everything that Biden and Blinken weren't able to do. Now, what he's done inadvertently, I don't know if Trump planned this. I think this is something that's maybe an unexpected side effect, is that within Israeli society, in one statement, Donald Trump legitimized the policy of transfer. Meaning a policy that was considered the exclusive property of the most problematic political elements of Israeli society is now something everybody's kind of like, oh, well, that's an option, right? Well, that makes sense, right? The President of the United States, by the way, that says something really embarrassing about us, that for us to be able to see a policy as legitimate, we need the American president to support it, give lip service to it, even if he doesn't mean it. Right? Once he says it, it's now legitimate. It's now within the pale, right, of the political conversation. I'm not saying it's a good policy, but I know there are a lot of Israelis who supported it on the low, and now they're willing to say they support it. Now they're willing to say publicly, maybe it's worth thinking about, right? It's considered a legitimate idea to consider, right? A legitimate policy to put on the table with all the other policies on the table, right? Whereas before it wasn't. Right? That's something Trump did, I think, without realizing he was doing it. I don't think Trump meant to legitimize a policy. And I don't know if Trump understands our society and our own internal complexes well enough to realize that by giving lip service to this policy, he's going to actually legitimize it in Israeli society. Because I don't think Trump meant it. Like, I don't think this is something that Trump actually meant to do or even legitimize. Not that he cares. Like, I don't know if that's something that's even important to him, right? But I do think that it's something that he doesn't really plan to do. And the fifth thing that he could be doing is trying to weaken Prime Minister Netanyahu, to actually make Netanyahu look weak by publicly stating that he supports all these policies, crushing Hamas, um, transferring the Arab population out of Gaza, etc., and behaving publicly, speaking publicly as if this is a policy that the United States supports, and the Prime Minister of Israel has the ability, the room, the maneuverability to do these things if he wants, and then Netanyahu doesn't do them. Because in reality, between Trump and Netanyahu, Trump says, don't you dare. Right? And what happens then? Then Netanyahu is seen as having a green light from Washington to do things that the Israeli far right has wanted him to do for decades, but isn't really going to do them because the Americans aren't really going to let him do them. And people like Ben Gvir are too provincial to understand that that might be how a US president behaves. So that's part of the game. Right? So I think those are some ideas to consider in terms of what's going on here. What I don't believe is happening is that Donald Trump is about to transfer the Palestinian population out of Gaza. I don't believe Israel is about to do so either. And I don't believe Trump will support Israeli annexation in the West Bank. I think that ultimately he will most likely try to move us towards a two-state paradigm of some kind. I think he'll try to show that he could accomplish what none of his predecessors were able to accomplish. And I think that he views Netanyahu as the major obstacle to being able to do that. Because I don't think there's any candidate for prime minister in the state of Israel other than Netanyahu who would, on ideological grounds, oppose, on principle, the division of our land. We have to also pay very close attention to the things Trump said when he wasn't in office, like the Barack Ravid interview, right? Where he says he like cursed Bibi and expressed like rage at Netanyahu for torpedoing his deal of the century, right? The Trump administration blamed Netanyahu for thwarting their plan to divide our country into two states. Kushner also wrote about it in his memoirs, right? So I think that Trump knows very well how Netanyahu operates. I think he's aware that Netanyahu is not going to go along, even if Netanyahu says he's going to go along with a two-state solution, he's not. And I think that Trump realizes, he sees that the only way to push that kind of solution is to get rid of Netanyahu, is to replace him with somebody else. And I think that almost anybody he could replace Netanyahu with would play ball, right? And even Netanyahu at this point, if I'm correct, I could be wrong, but if I'm correct, I think even Netanyahu probably isn't 100% sure how he's going to try to outmaneuver Trump. Because I think Trump is a very frightening, very dangerous personality. Like, I think he's brilliant. I think he's really highly intelligent, at least in terms of like what we'll call street smarts, right? He comes from the world of New York real estate, which is extremely cutthroat, and I think that he's also like clearly like a narcissistic bully who is desperately trying to restore like U.S. imperial power, or at least the perception of U.S. imperial power on the global stage.